Before I knew anything about how software worked, before I ever even wrote my very first line of code, I decided that I was going to build an MMORPG by myself because that's a sane thing to do. And I almost did it. I almost pulled it off until I completely fell apart and crashed and burned. But that experience, it completely changed the trajectory of my entire career and of my entire life. I'm Josh. I'm a software engineering executive with around 2 decades of experience in the software industry, from writing code to running companies. But today, I want to take you back to the very beginning of that 2 decades, back to the early 2000s, when I was a teenager who was really into video games. Two video games specifically, Halo 1 and old school RuneScape. Or specifically back then, it was just RuneScape, or new RuneScape actually, because RuneScape Classic was kind of ending and this was RuneScape 2, back before the Varrock guards looked like this. That's wrong. That's not what they're supposed to look like. But anyway, my reaction to getting really, really into RuneScape was somebody built this, right? You got to remember at the time, so it was a browser-based game at the time when it first came out. There wasn't a client that you download and run on your desktop. You opened up your browser, you went to the website, and you were able to play a game completely just from your browser. And that was kind of mind-blowing at the time. Honestly, it still kind of is mind-blowing, but that entire game was browser-based. And my reaction to that was effectively, well, they did this, so surely I can do this too, right? If they did it, I could do this. I'm talking about things that, you see other people are accomplished, right? If somebody else is able to accomplish that goal, the only thing standing in your way of accomplishing that goal is a factor of pretty much time and resources, right? And so I saw this amazing game out there. I was like, this is crazy. This is like transforming my life, what I'm seeing on the screen here. I want to try to do this. I'm going to do this too. Because that's obviously a totally rational reaction for a normal human to have when they play a video game is, I'm going to make this, right? Of course, why not? So what did I do? I went out to Barnes& and Noble and I looked for a book on how to start programming. I think it was like Intro to Video Games. I looked there was a programming section at Barnes& and Noble, looking through all the books. They had like 4 or 5 intro to programming books there at the time, and I spent probably 2 or 3 hours agonizing over which book was the right one to start my journey. Something that's completely arbitrary. And honestly, looking back, I don't even remember which one I chose. But I bought the book, I went home, and I started learning how to do this with the objective in mind of building my own MMO. And what I wanted to do, I was effectively going to make RuneScape in space, right? Halo meets RuneScape. That was teenage me's goal in mind. And at the time too, I think EVE Online had just come out. So even at the time, I was like, wow, there's like no competition in this sci-fi MMO space. This would be really cool to tap into here. And that's what I was going to try to do. Obviously, with no experience in programming, with no knowledge of how computers work whatsoever, I'm going to make an MMO. I didn't buy the book and just immediately start coding an MMO. I went through the chapters. I learned about, the basics of whatever language I was doing at the time. I think it was actually Basic, oddly enough, was what I learned in. And then I started to apply that to figuring out how something of the scope of an MMORPG actually works. I mean, think about it. And I still think about it this way to this day. An MMORPG is actually an amazing microcosm to learn all about everything to do with programming. Because to develop something like that, you kind of need to understand like the entire scope and depth of whatever technology stack you're working in. And you know what? I'll actually throw some screenshots up here so that you can take a look at kind of some of the different stages of development that I went through. I even started up a website for the game. I got a PHBB board up and running for forums, right? Because forums, it was before Reddit. Forums were really popular back then. So everything had its own forum. So I was like, all right, got to have, a PHBB board. If you were around on the internet back then, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you weren't, then you really missed out. Debatable whether that's actually something you missed out on, but whatever. I got that up and running and I actually started to build a community around this thing that I was developing. And if you're familiar with communities on the internet, maybe you're starting to see where the story's going. But I was building this thing and I was building this kind of community online a little bit. It was very small. I'm not going to try to blow this out of proportion. It was only a few people, right? This wasn't like some massive grassroots organization that I was building. Some people came to the forums, they were interested, they put their opinions in there, they followed along a little bit with the development. And I even got my friends involved to some degree. Like, some people would come and go. They'd be like, "Oh, cool. I'll try my hand at making, little item images or a 3D object or something like that." Nobody really stuck around to the project that long. I would kind of bring people in and out as they were interested, and then, teenagers, interest fades pretty quickly, right? But not mine. I was laser focused on this thing. I was stuck in and fully invested in building this game, and maybe a little bit too invested, right? So part of having that community that I started building on those forums, I started to have a lot of expectations that I was putting on myself. I was building my knowledge of software at the time and learning how to code, but it's also a very transformative time in your life for building social awareness and social maturity in a way. And so it's not something that I really fully had yet. And so I was putting a lot of pressure on myself, putting a lot of undue expectations that I can't let these people down, right? There's people out there that are expecting this product from me. I need to deliver it. So I was spending, all night sometimes, staying up all night working on this thing to try to push it forward a little bit more and a little bit more and make it into more and more of a product that I'd be able to show off and that people would be able to play and enjoy. And it really did. It really got far. I had developed an entire world that took place in space, right? So there wasn't a whole lot of map design, but you had ships, you could fly around, there were abilities and skills. You could fire, lasers and missiles at NPCs that would fly around the world as well. You had an inventory, you were able to, get loot drops and equip like armor and different weapons and things like that to your ship. Trade from different stations and switch maps by little like stargates that were in the system, and interact with other people while you're in there. Type and see what other people were doing, and even shoot at other players' ships and blow them up and things like that. There was a lot of features that I actually got implemented into that game. But the more and more that I got implemented, the more I felt the pressure of these expectations. I don't think many people who happened upon this website and this random forum, in the early 2000s were super invested into my video game, right? They stopped by, they thought it was cool. Okay, end of story. But I was projecting that there were these massive expectations on my shoulders and I couldn't let these people down. And it really, really started to weigh on me and push me further. And in a way, it was a good way, right? It pushed me to develop my skills in ways that I never, ever would have done otherwise. To learn about all these different systems, all these different interconnected ways that go into building something as complex as an MMORPG, right? All these systems from networking to virtual economies, databases and backend stuff where you are saving all the players' information. I did a little bit with DirectX and OpenGL, trying to compare and contrast and figure out which would be best for the longevity of the game. 2D graphics, 3D graphics, even how servers worked, right? I had to get my own virtual machine. And so, in that regard, it was amazing for my learning and development. But on the other hand, it was really, really taking a mental toll on me, trying to live up for these expectations that, again, I was mostly putting on myself. And looking back, like having 2020 vision in retrospect, had I just released what I had then, it probably would have been more complete than a lot of the MMOs that we've seen released in recent years, right? Especially with how things go and release in these alpha states with missing features and bugs and stuff like that. Granted, it also probably would have crashed when there was more than 10 players online. But obviously, knowing what you know now, 20 years later, is very different than being in that situation at that time. And at the end of the day, it really just ended up being too much for me to handle at that point in my life. I won't say I broke down, but I shuttered the site, I turned off the forums, I left a little message there saying, thanks for your support. We're shuttering development at this time for resources or whatever things. And I just turned it all off and I stepped back. I was like, I can't do this anymore. And in retrospect, I think that was the right decision because it allowed me to go back to focusing on just my normal everyday life. And so all of that work kind of came crashing down and burning, but something really, really important came out of it. And what I learned there, it wasn't just how to program. What goes in to making a product? I mean, what really goes into making a product? Not just what you think goes into it, but all of the different roles that go into something, all of the different things you have to think about: website administration, social media organization, the developers, the graphics designers, IT, all of those kind of things that go into it that you don't think about, as well as just how you interact with, customers or those people on the forums and boards and things like that. It gave me a whole different understanding of an industry that I had been involved in from the consumer's point of view. And that understanding and that insight really shifted and changed the way I looked at everything. It's really what led me directly to my first real jobs in programming. The first things that I was working on in the actual industry were real-time ticker feeds for Wall Street. And you might think, well, what's that got to do with what you were talking about? But really, it's an MMO for stock traders. And being able to look at it, right? To look at it from that perspective, like, well, I did this. I wrote real-time networking systems that are just like this, sending bits and bytes back and forth and trying to get everything you can out of, 16 bits going back and forth, or how many bytes, whatever you're using, right? And so that information, that was what allowed me to excel in those first few roles and get those first few roles to begin with. And so that failed project, that failed MMORPG, sure, it crashed, it burned, but that is what directly led me into the rest of my software career, and something that taught me skills that, to be honest, surpass anything I have learned in an individual situation since then, whether it's in college or from individual jobs I've had. The skills that I learned, the concepts that I came across building that project were foundational and some of the most important lessons that I have learned in my entire professional career, all the way back from 20 years ago. And so I guess what I'm kind of saying here is a cliche. It's that nothing is a failure if you learn from it. But going beyond that, sometimes the biggest, most important learning lessons, the things that teach you the most, are the failures, right? Because it wasn't the lack of knowledge or trying to start something when I didn't really know what I was getting into that led to that downfall. It was my mental state. It was my emotional maturity, which is something that in many ways is just as important in your professional career as all those other technical skills. And learning that about myself was also something that I was able to learn from and build upon. And so that learning experience in many ways was just as important as all of the information and all of the technology that I digested during that process as well. And sure, that project, that MMO, that never came to light. And hopefully that code never does come to light. But the lessons learned from it are things that have followed me through the last 2 decades and will continue to follow me through the rest of my career. And I actually did end up publishing a video game later on in my career. Granted, it was a much smaller scope, much simpler process than a full-on MMORPG. But who knows? Maybe I'll end up going back to my roots one day. So that's the video about how I originally got into the software field to begin with. I hope you found that interesting. Maybe it was a little bit enlightening for you of kind of what my journey was and the lessons that I learned along the way. If you like that video, please drop a like. Tell me in the comments about your experiences, things that you've tackled, projects that you wanted to take on that were well outside of your scope, that either you pulled off or ended up crashing disastrously. I'd love to hear about all of your individual experiences. And if you're interested in following along the tech industry with news and updates, follow the channel. There'll be more videos coming soon.